workshop. The Community Development Partnership leads the Lower Cape in building a diverse year-round community of people who can afford to live, work, and thrive here. To accomplish our mission, we promote, develop, and manage affordable housing, nurture the launch and growth of small businesses, and facilitate collaboration with business, nonprofit, and government partners, many of those who are here right now. The 8 towns that we serve are Provincetown, Truro, Wellfleet, Eastham, Orleans, Brewster, Harwich, and Chatham. And for those of you that are new to the Lower Cape Housing Institute, we provide education and technical assistance to municipalities to help towns address the housing crisis. We do this by offering workshops on housing topics and coordinated relationship building across towns throughout our peer group meetings. And speaking of our peer group meetings, CDP, we host regular peer group meetings, which are an informal discussion space for folks like yourself, municipal officials, and town staff who are involved in or interested in housing production on the Lower Cape. Towns will have an opportunity to share updates during these peer group meetings on their housing initiatives and projects. You are all invited and encouraged to join our quarterly peer group meetings. Our next spring Outer and Lower Cape peer group meetings are happening on Tuesday, April 11th and Thursday, April 13th, respectively, from 3 to 4:30. We will make sure that all of you that are registered and attending this workshop will be added to our newsletter if you're not already, to learn more about this and our upcoming events. A couple things before we get started here with our Housing 101 workshop is to remember to keep yourself on mute. Raise your hands if there's a question, and we will do our best to get to it as quickly as possible. And you can always type questions in the chat. We know there's a number of folks here that are in the housing field as well. So if somebody puts a question in the chat and you feel like you know the answer, definitely feel free to chime in. That's no problem. Now let's go ahead and get started. Andrea will introduce herself. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Andrea Aldana. I am Chief Program Officer at the Community Development Partnership. I've been with the CDP since 2011 and working in the housing space since 2017. There are a lot of people on this meeting right now who could probably teach this, so I hope that you all support each other in posting questions and answering them in the chat so that I can be really efficient with our time. I do want to warn you that the presentation that you are seeing is a little non-conventional, so it's a living presentation. As part of the follow-up materials, you'll be receiving the link to this presentation, and it's an active presentation that you can click on. It has a lot of resources built into it, and it's designed for you to be able to go back to it, learn more, dig deeper, and read through the resources that are linked. So Housing 101 includes topics that could each take hours to cover, and in fact, we have hours of content going deeper into each of these different areas on our YouTube channel, which we'll also share with you in the follow-up materials. So this workshop is meant to cover a whole range of topics related to housing production at a very, very high level, at a very introductory level. And I will do my best to not speak too quickly, but you will notice that I am brushing through some concepts and giving you resources to learn more, just so that we can keep within a reasonable time frame. So let's jump in. One thing that we would love for you to do is to let us know who you are, share a little bit about yourself by posting in the chat your name, your town, and your board or committee affiliation if you have one. It just gives us a really nice sense of who's in the room. If you could go ahead and do that, we would appreciate it. And then I just want to offer some learning guidelines. Housing development and affordable housing is a topic that a lot of people feel passionately about. And when we're talking about it, we want to make sure that we all provide space for each other to ask questions, share the air, balance inquiry and advocacy. Many of us are probably on the same page about various housing production strategies, but not everybody. And so make sure that you are not using your question time to advocate a point of view. Keep your comments concise. And like I said, folks should feel free to respond to each other's questions and comments. Brad already shared a little bit about our mission. So one thing that I want you to understand is the context of the Housing Institute. The Housing Institute is actually a sub-program of a larger program called the Lower Cape Community Housing Partnership. And through traditional community organizing and leadership development strategies, along with a series of workshops and trainings like this, the Lower Cape Community Housing Partnership increases the capacity of towns to meet the housing needs of our residents in 3 ways. The first is through this Housing Institute. So the purpose of the Lower Cape Housing Institute is to train elected and appointed municipal officials and town staff. We hold a series of workshops basically outside of the summer that equip town officials and staff with the knowledge, resources, and skills needed to help your towns create housing opportunities. And we measure success around 3 main outcome categories. One is we want to see towns implement zoning bylaws, changes in zoning that support housing development. We also want to see an increase in the number of affordable units on each town's subsidized housing inventory. And if you don't know what that is, we will talk about that. And we'd like to see towns increase utilization of local funding, including Community Preservation Act funding and short-term rental revenues for housing production. As Brad mentioned, there's a lot to cover, so please try and hold your questions to the end or post them in the chat. When we're ready to answer your questions, we'll ask you to raise your hand using the Zoom raise your hand feature, or we'll just go through the questions as they show up in the chat. All right, so what is housing? Why is it so important? Well, your home is where you spend most of your life. It's where you sleep, it's where you grow, it's where you experience relationships, and people simply cannot bring their whole selves to any other aspect of their lives when their home is not safe or stable. Housing meets 3 basic needs. It serves as a physical need, your shelter. It provides psychological safety, and it also has a social component because it's where families and home relationships are built and founded. It's important to understand the rural determinants of health. So what does a community look like with a healthy supply of housing? Well, housing is the foundation of a healthy community. Without housing, families are under stress. The lack of housing undermines mental and physical health. Kids can't arrive at school ready to learn. Families can't save for emergencies or retirement or college, and people can't manage the unexpected. We would also say that a community with a healthy supply of housing is attractive, is energy efficient, and is demographically diverse. So a community with a healthy supply of housing actually looks better. It's more interesting and it has more character. Roof lines are broken up. The community might look more like a village than a suburb. And in a healthy community, you'll be able to see a variety of sizes and types of housing, homes that are well sited and where there are good transitions between commercial and residential areas, and housing that's close to the center of town to encourage walkable communities. This is known as village-centered development. You should definitely check out this Missing Middle Housing website to get a sense of all the different housing types besides just single-family homes that can fit into our communities to give our residents more affordable options. And healthy communities have energy efficient home options. Energy efficient and decarbonized homes save residents money by lowering utility costs, and they're also climate resilient. Not only are they cheaper to live in, but energy efficient communities are walkable because homes are sited close to transportation, work, and amenities. And a community with a healthy supply of housing has homes available for all kinds of people. And so these communities are diverse in every sense, especially racially, economically, and in terms of family size and structure. So if you want to support a diverse community, you need to have a diversity of housing types. So let's dig into what we mean when we say the term affordable housing. Affordable housing usually means housing that is priced to be affordable to households making between 30 and 80% of area median income. It depends what we're talking about, what program we're talking about, which community we're talking about. Affordable housing can mean different things, but generally speaking, this is a useful definition. The glossary that's on your screen comes from a great community development magazine called Shelter Force. And if you click on it, you will be able to download it, and it gives you definitions to all the different terms that you'll hear thrown at you in the alphabet soup of affordable housing development. I won't go into all of them now, but it's a really great resource for you to come back to. So what does affordability mean? A home is affordable to a household when that household spends no more than 30% of their income on housing costs. So a household that spends more than 30% of their income on housing costs is considered to be cost burdened. And people who are cost burdened just can't afford to pay for other things associated with a good standard of living, like food and healthcare and education, emergency savings, all those things. You'll often hear this concept of big A versus small a affordable housing. So homes can be affordable just because of how they're priced in a naturally occurring rental market, or because they are specifically created to be affordable for a specific income range. This lowercase a, known as naturally occurring affordable housing, is affordable housing that is built without government subsidy and is still priced affordably for most people in the area. For a variety of reasons that we'll touch on, the private sector has not produced housing that is affordable to people who live here year round. And so this is why we have this workshop, and this is why we do what we do. Towns need to intervene because the market is not serving this basic need for housing in our communities. So that's why we advocate for capital A affordable housing, which is subsidized housing. We need to provide this critical resource to our community so that we can have a community at all. And we do this by intervening in the public sector to provide land and other resources in order to subsidize the creation of housing. And Chapter 40B is the most common mechanism to produce housing. Again, Chapter 40B is a whole other workshop. We actually have done this workshop several times. But the Cliffs Notes are that Chapter 40B is a state statute that provides developers relief from restrictive zoning and an expedited and comprehensive permitting process in exchange for at least 25% of the units created being affordable. It has created, regardless of how you feel about it, it has created the most affordable housing in the state compared to any other mechanism. And it provides an incentive to towns that meet a 10% threshold. So when people talk about the percentage of housing that you have affordable, that is that 10% threshold that they're referring to. And again, you can learn a lot more about Chapter 40B and Zoning Board of Appeals role in a Chapter 40B permitting process through the resource that's linked here. This is actually an amazing handbook that was developed with Massachusetts Housing Partnership, and it's something we recommend all ZBAs read before they ever get a request from a developer in front of them. It's just a really important educational resource to be aware of. So why don't we have a healthy supply of housing on the Cape, which we would argue is the case? We do not. Well, essentially, it's a combination of market disconnection, high cost of building, and a resulting affordability gap. So housing costs are essentially, like most things, a function of supply and demand. We have a documented low supply of housing and housing production, and we also have a lot of demand for the housing and land that exists. At least half of the vacation homes in the state are on the Cape. And let's see, I think I'm not going to get into all of these bubbles. I'll leave that for you to dig into. But essentially what is important to understand is that our market is dictated by higher off-Cape incomes, like second homeowners, short-term rentals. These are the market forces that are driving demand up and creating this affordability gap. And so that's why on the Cape, we simply do not have a normal housing market compared to other places. And the result is that land values are really high, and local year-rounders are always competing with the buying power of people from off-Cape with higher salaries. And there's the cost of building. Every aspect of building on Cape Cod is more expensive. Before COVID, off-Cape, it costed about $350,000 to build one unit of housing, and on Cape, it was about $400,000. Now, post-COVID or during COVID, whatever you want to call it right now, we're seeing per unit cost on the Cape closer to $500,000. And affordable housing costs less to residents, but it costs just as much to build as any other type of housing, which is why it requires a subsidy. We know that we don't have a healthy supply of housing because of the affordability gap. So the affordability gap is an indication of housing stress. It represents the number of existing households spending 30% or more of their monthly income on housing and are therefore expected to become cost burdened. And this worsens as you move away from the Mid-Cape and toward Provincetown. I want to give you just a couple visuals to help you visualize what we mean by the affordability gap. And this is all data that's provided by the Cape Cod Commission from their 2017 Regional Housing Market Study, which does need to be updated, and they are working on that. But I want to give you an example of the type of data that they are collecting and the type of visuals that they are creating, because you can always go and ask the Cape Cod Commission to adapt this data for your own use as you're doing presentations in your town and making the case in your own community. So this shows us that for the 4 towns in the Outer Cape, if you look at the red line, which is the median household income, and the blue bar, which is ownership, home costs, you'll see that the ability to own your own home is far out of reach for most households in the Outer Cape. And if you look at the Lower Cape, same dynamic. Now, a lot of people will look at these charts and say, well, yes, no one can buy, but it looks like it's really easy for people to rent. And the challenge with our rental data is that we don't have enough of it to actually extrapolate useful meaning. So while there might be affordable rents for these particular household incomes, there's no supply. So it's really not a useful data point to understand that renting is feasible here, because there isn't actually any inventory for people to access. We talked about this already. I think I have to pop through some more useful stats from the Cape Cod Commission's second home survey. This is an interesting example in Provincetown. So short-term rentals are not unique to the Cape, but coupled with our desirable location, they make up a significant portion of our housing stock, and that's especially true in Provincetown. And something that you could do in your community, something that you could study, is what Provincetown studied, where they learned that they got the numbers to describe the significance of short-term rentals in their community, and realize that the reason why we are sort of fighting a losing battle in terms of short-term rentals is because in the Outer Cape communities in particular, and more so in the Lower Cape communities increasingly, a homeowner can rent out their unit on a short-term basis, make more money than if they were to rent it year-round, and also benefit from being able to use that unit in the off-season. And so when you have that sort of dynamic, there's just really no incentive to rent year-round, and we're seeing that play out in the region. But I wanted you to be aware of this study, which you can go back and read. And then, of course, there are zoning limitations that are keeping us from having a healthy supply of housing. Whatever your zoning makes it easiest to build is what you're likely to see more of. And the Cape's overwhelming development pattern is single-family homes on 1-acre lots. Zoning is also limited by the availability of municipal water and sewer, which determines how many people can occupy a unit of land. And historically, towns have not allowed for infrastructure as an intentional strategy to curb development, especially housing development. And then, of course, there's a lack of public support or resistance to change. I should say perceived lack of support, because actually many people do support housing because they need it. But oftentimes they're working multiple jobs or taking care of children, or are uncomfortable speaking up at a town or committee meeting. What I'm going to get into in the next few slides, next several slides, are meant to share the so-called categories of NIMBYism, and the purpose is for you to know what to expect, not so much to understand every single category and the why, but to give you the tools to be able to dig in deeper, know what to expect, because you're going to hear oftentimes the same set of concerns coming up over and over and over. It's actually very, very predictable, and it's useful to understand the data points that you can use to respond to those concerns. So that's what we'll be providing. And it's also really important to understand that those voices, those NIMBY voices, and for those who don't know, NIMBY stands for Not in My Backyard. Folks that are sharing these NIMBY voices, these NIMBY concerns, don't necessarily represent our entire community. So there was a study from Boston University several years ago that showed something interesting. It showed that most of the people who show up at planning board meetings to voice their concerns are disproportionately older, male, and white. And they provide a very specific and limited point of view, and they're shaping our local policies about how land is and is not used. So the reason why we're sharing this study is because we'd like you to dig in and understand, and also recognize the importance of coming up with community engagement tactics that cast a wider net so that you're getting more diverse views. So people who are not supportive of housing are known as NIMBYs, and no matter where you are, it's pretty much always the same comments. It's fascinating to me. So the good news is that you can prepare for them, but you still need to be sure to listen and address people's concerns when they are reasonable. So the first category we'll hear a lot is the fiscal category, sometimes coupled with concerns around children and the number of children in a development. So this is a group of residents who believe that mixed use village style development will create a major fiscal negative. Along these lines, we often hear the myth that affordable housing equals more children, which, if it were true, should not be a reason to deter housing development, because children are part of our communities and go on to become members of our communities. But actually, the data shows it's not true. Single family homes produce more children than multifamily apartment style developments, including affordable housing developments. And frankly, our schools need more children because they're losing, enrollment numbers have been going down for a long time. The next category you will always hear. Oh, what did I do? Oh, sorry. I pressed the wrong button. Please hold. I must have skipped forward. Let me see if I can fix this. Talking about what is housing. Yeah. Cool. So traffic is a really big concern for many, and many times the concern is simply not well-founded. But either way, you can just know for sure by doing a peer-reviewed traffic study. This is something that would come up during a ZBA public hearing. And so you should definitely commission a peer-reviewed traffic study to just know whether or not traffic is something that's impacting your community when there is a particular development being proposed. But either way, the way to address these concerns is to make the case for village center development that will minimize traffic. And this is really, we think about siting your housing appropriately in an area where it makes sense, rather than in the middle of a residential area where increased traffic would be more of a concern. The third category of dissent we'll cover deals with the word density. So folks who are concerned about density they generally believe that mixed use village style development will create something completely out of character and become an irreversible mistake. So we would encourage you to reframe the density conversation around design and place. People often say that density is ugly, but we really think that that's a myth. Anything can be ugly, frankly. And a dense development can certainly be beautiful. And there are a lot of examples in New England of beautiful dense development. They're also typically known as being charming. One way to deal with concerns about density in your community is to try developing a visual preference survey. The Cape Cod Commission did this for 4 towns on the Cape several years ago. It gives people a sense, it allows the community to define what in character looks like for their own town without focusing on density. So you ask a set of questions about what things look like rather than how many people live in them. And you can go into the Cape Cod Commission's website to learn more about that. And then the last category is the people category. Some people have wrong ideas about who needs or lives in affordable housing. Please do not let these ideas run rampant in your community without addressing them. People tend to agree that we want to attract more young families to our region, for example, but you really can't do that without housing. So people kind of get stuck on who are the folks who we hope to attract in our housing development, and kind of placing them higher than other types of households. And we just don't think that that line of messaging is useful in the long run. There are some resources that we would like you to check out, and we'll put them in the follow-up materials. Enterprise Community does a really great job of putting together reports around messaging and specific messages that are more useful to talk about housing development. All right, so who needs it? The need for community housing is actually not unique to us. It is a nationwide problem, and there are very few counties in the country where the median home price matches median income. A useful way to understand a need is to look at recent housing lotteries that have happened in your area. It's difficult to truly understand housing need at the town level, and also it's really not that useful to serving community needs to drill down to town-specific data. The housing market just doesn't mirror town data. There are other factors driving development that are exclusive of town-specific data. So we like to point to the results from housing lotteries. And so there have been several lotteries recently: Village at Nauset Green in Eastham, Brewster Woods and Brewster, and then Community Housing Resource did a waiting list lottery. And just an example of a couple of takeaways from the waiting list lottery. We learned that we need units for very low income residents. The concept of community housing right now and serving households that are at moderate income levels is really trendy right now. And yes, we do absolutely need housing for folks at a wide variety of income levels. And we also still have tremendous need for housing at very low income, for very low income households. And in that lottery, we saw that 58% of the applicants were making less than $30,000 a year. We also have seen in these lottery results that there is tremendous need for 1-bedroom units. 82% of applicants in the Community Housing Resource Lottery were 1-person households, and 13% needed 2-bedroom households or 2-bedroom households. And the lotteries at the Village at Nauset Green showed similar findings. So there are other ways to describe need besides just census data, which is frankly not terribly accurate when you're in a rural community. A needs assessment is an important aspect of developing your housing production goals. Every town does a housing production plan that includes a needs assessment, which can give you some baseline data for your town. Of course, the census and the Cape Cod Commission also provide town-specific data if you need it. And if you don't have the data that you need to make housing production decisions, using town funds to pay for that type of study is a great use of local resources. Just quickly going to touch on area median income because it comes up a lot as a term that we use. So area median income, or AMI, as you'll most often hear it referred to, is the midpoint of a region's income distribution. It's more useful than average median income, which gets skewed by higher salaries. This data is released by HUD annually, and it's used to determine which household incomes fit within which affordability range. And so you'll generally hear folks refer to household AMIs at 30%, 60%, 80%, 100%, depending on the program that we're describing. Another example of visual data that you might want to have in your pocket and ask the Cape Cod Commission to modify for your town and make it current is this how many earners concept. A lot of times it's useful to have something visual that people can react to. It's more useful than a data point. So this helps you communicate the housing crisis in your town. And essentially what you'll generally find is that it takes a very large household size to be able to own, certainly, and oftentimes rent a unit. It's not something that a household of 1 or 2 could typically afford. And this is just a useful way of visualizing that. And it's for the top 5 industry sectors. And like I said, you could ask the Cape Cod Commission to adapt this for your own town. Here's an Outer Cape example. So you can ask for a regional visualization or a town-specific visualization. And we find that people connect better with that type of visual data. And when we're talking about data, it's really important to understand that you need to know your data, but please don't use it as a main talking point. Stories are far more impactful than data. So as part of your housing advocacy, make sure that you develop a bank of housing stories that you can refer to. Data really doesn't resonate the way stories do. And so once you get the slides, you'll be able to click through and see some materials that we've put together to tell the story of who needs housing. We have a media campaign with the tagline, we can't afford to lose the people who can't afford to live here, is one way that we have tried to dispel the myths about who live in or need affordable housing. And these campaigns and ads are available to anyone who would like to use them to make your case. And then we also developed a video for Harbor Hill in Provincetown that's a community housing development. And I'm not going to show the whole video now, but these are just resources, local resources that can help you tell the story in our region. And that's important, like I mentioned, if you're going to make it visual so that people can connect to it more easily than a data point. And there are a lot of resources out there that you can use to make your materials more visually engaging, and it goes a long way. So let's talk a little bit about what housing can look like. The elephant in the room is that historically affordable housing didn't used to look so great. But thanks to the Fair Housing Act creating rules against segregation, we know that affordable housing developments are more successful when they mirror organic neighborhoods that are made up of diverse households, especially diverse incomes. And we often hear that towns want to produce senior housing, but the future is intergenerational housing that allows for one-bedroom units as well as units for families. So just some things to keep in mind as you're thinking about what housing can look like in your community that's built for the future. Here are some local examples that we think are really nice to look at. Something to keep in mind is that the same person can say that a large single family home looks great on their street, but that same design gets rejected when it can house 4 households. So again, we encourage you to focus on design rather than what's going on inside the envelope of a building, and we think you'll reach more supporters. The Cape Cod Commission did a visual preference survey in several towns, including Eastham in our region, and many people were happy with their designs, even as they cling to ideas about community character. And this could be because the Outer Cape has a history of modern house design. So here are some examples of Lower Cape affordable housing developments that we think make sense in their towns. There's Stable Path in Provincetown, Sally's Way in Truro, Rock Harbor Village. Oh, actually, Rock Harbor Village isn't in this one anymore. Thankful Chase's Pathway is our own in Harwich. And a lot of them were developed by Community Housing Resource, and we think they're beautiful. I should say it is useful to also build a bank of images that you think resonate with people in your community so that you can draw on them for presentations. Because at the end of the day, what something looks like is all anyone wants to talk about. And again, we believe that housing can be dense and look good and fit within our communities. We think that we need to embrace density, including focusing on developments of 40 units or more, remembering that it takes the same amount of time, energy, and engagement to build 10 units versus 100 units. Very low-income households need the support of on-site property management, and developments with fewer than 40 units just cannot support on-site property management. Critically, a major source of subsidy is a low-income tax credit, which we'll talk about in a bit. And when that's removed, it leaves a huge gap other than town resources. But the low-income tax credit can only be used for larger developments. And larger developments with increased density are the best way to have more mixed income intergenerational neighborhoods. Larger developments building up rather than out also allow us to preserve more green and open space. So we'll talk a little bit about how it gets built. First of all, if you have not visited Massachusetts Housing Partnership's Housing Toolbox, run there immediately. It's linked several times throughout this presentation. Almost all of your questions will be answered, at least in part, by this toolbox, and it has tons of other reports that you can dig into. And it's our sort of first line of defense when communities ask us about anything in particular. It really is incredibly useful. So development takes a long time, a lot of special expertise, and a lot of money. I'm going to really quickly go through the various steps of development. But one thing that's important is that towns should be thinking of themselves as being in partnership with developers as opposed to in opposition. And when towns work closely with developers in a friendly way, you will often get a much better outcome. So the first stage in any development process is just the planning phase, understanding what your housing needs are, having a housing production plan, or even something a little more expansive like Provincetown's community housing playbook that lays out exactly what your strategies and goals are over a specific timeline. We encourage towns to develop a development strategy. This means that towns already know how many units they need, how many units they're going to build and when, where those units should be, and making sure that they have zoning and infrastructure to support those goals, how much money they're going to allocate and other resources like infrastructure and funding, how much of all those resources are going to be allocated for X number of units, and to really lay that out in a way that is a shared vision between all the different boards and committees that are involved in housing production and strategy. And so everyone understands what the town needs to accomplish, how and when. And there's internal consensus in town government. Once a site is chosen, there's going to be a certain amount of pre-development and site assessment work that the town usually needs to take on its own before you even start looking for a developer, and that costs money. Pre-COVID, that was $50,000 was pretty typical. That has probably increased now. And it really depends on what your own town's capacity is to take on some of this work without having to outsource it. But just be aware that there are upfront costs to any kind of housing development, and usually trusts and support can provide the funding to cover those costs. Once the town has a site, understands all the parameters about what they're willing to provide and how they're going to support housing development, then it's time to develop a request for proposals. And so the RFP is the place where a town signals to the development community what the town needs and what the town wants without being too prescriptive. The most important guideline we have for writing a good RFP is to not do it yourself. Massachusetts Housing Partnership offers technical assistance for this. They will often write it for you. And there are lots of examples of communities in the Lower Cape who have worked closely with MHP to develop a strong request for proposals and make sure that it doesn't violate any fair housing, and it's expansive enough to allow for the most creative developers and high quality developers that you can possibly attract. Then hopefully multiple developers will respond to a town's RFP. And there's a developer selection process. It's different in every town. For example, Wellfleet had a 95 Lawrence Road task force that was in charge of selecting a developer. And what's most important is that you figure out your criteria and make sure that they match the needs of your community, and then stick with that process. Once you select your developer, then the town is pretty much out of the equation. There is an important permitting process, of course, and more often than not, the developer will need a comprehensive permit to get some zoning relief. And I have to give kudos to my colleagues who showed that with really strong community engagement, you can have a quick permitting process with no opposition, which is the best possible scenario for a housing development. And then the developer builds the project. It takes a lot longer than that, is more complicated, but for our purposes, we'll just say they build the project. And then it's just to say that there is a bit of an ongoing role on the municipality side, particularly in terms of tracking the affordable units, the units that are deed restricted affordable, to make sure that they make it onto your subsidized housing inventory, which is how we track that 10% of affordable housing in your town. And to make sure that any towns that have any units that have a deed restriction that might expire are, that there are efforts to not let it expire so that you can keep those units on your SHI. So funding. Again, this is multiple workshops in one that we could talk about in order to really understand all of the funding landscape when it comes to affordable housing development. What we think is most important for towns to understand is that the developer is the expert on understanding the funding mix for a development, not the town. And so towns should not be evaluating a development based on the funding sources that they have lined up for that project. we do encourage that each town should have a stable source of significant revenue for housing and be prepared to offer that for any development that comes up in your town, because there will be a funding gap. Let's see. So this is just an example of different types of local funds that municipalities can be allocating for housing production. Usually these funds are most effective if they go directly into your affordable housing trust or any other type of housing trust that you may have. We'll touch on that a little bit later. I won't get into all of these. Obviously, CPA is the primary funding source, but we would also argue that short-term rental tax revenues should be up there at the top of your priority list. So you need a lot of local money to leverage state and federal money. Understanding housing financing is an entire career. Here is a website where you can start to learn a little bit more about the low-income housing tax credit, which is the primary source of funding for housing development. We do have a workshop coming up in March that is going to be about funding housing development. So if you want to learn more about funding sources, you should definitely register for that one. The important thing to know is that there is barely any funding for housing for households between 80% and 120% of area median income. The low-income housing tax credit is one of the largest sources of federal funding for affordable housing. And over the life of the program, low-income tax credits have been responsible for the creation or rehab of nearly 3 million apartments for low and moderate income families. And the credits are typically sold to investors, which generates equity for rental developments serving families with incomes below 60% of area median income. So this is why those other local funding so critical, because they fill the gap above 60% of AMI. Here is a quick little example that you can dig into further of funding sources used for the Village at Nauset Green in Eastham. If you see on the right, the largest source of funds by far is a low-income tax credit at $10 million. And you can also see just how much subsidy was provided by the town through CPA and other sources, just to give you a sense of how much you can expect a town to invest in any type of housing development. And we are seeing right now with construction costs and labor shortages driving the cost way up. Every large scale development on the Lower Cape has $1 million funding gap right now. So that is common at this point. So you just have to, rather than focusing on all the different funding sources, it's a nice thing to know, but what you really need to focus on is the balancing act. Making a development work is a balancing act. On the one hand, you have your costs and your requirements, and on the other side, you have your funding and your debt. And the variable that towns can control in between, in addition to more funding, is time and predictability. Developers prefer to work in a community where the time between when they respond to an RFP and when they can actually break ground is as short as possible, and that it's a supportive community so that they have high predictability and they can ensure the economic feasibility of a project, which is essentially what it all boils down to. So what do we need to do to get the best housing? Well, we've touched on a lot of this already, but my favorite part about housing development is that we already know how to get it done. I have to start with community engagement. It's probably not the first thing that folks think of, but please do not underestimate the importance of great community engagement, as we saw this past year in Wellfleet and Provincetown. Engagement can be used in 3 basic scenarios: planning a specific project or ongoing education. Having an ongoing conversation within your town is critical to creating a culture of support for housing, but you have to be creative and intentional. Make sure that you map out who the community needs to hear from and how to best engage them, and think about how to make the process more accessible to increase diverse input. Think about multiple ways to engage and be strategic in your outreach. We recommend that you think of an engagement team that includes boards and committees within your town, as well as other stakeholders outside of your town and town staff. They're all working together. Community engagement for planning comes up when you're developing a strategic plan, a local comprehensive plan, a housing production plan. It's really important to get buy-in on the planning side really early on, before you've ever even identified a site. And then community engagement for a specific project or initiative is where we think you should put a lot of your energy into, and the CDP would be happy to help a developer work on a specific development to get that permitted quickly and without opposition, as we did in Wellfleet and Provincetown. And then community engagement for ongoing education, again, just to create this culture of support so that you're not only talking about housing when there's a specific site being discussed. And so everyone has a shared understanding and community vision about what the needs are and what we're going to do in a town to advance our housing production goals to meet those needs. This is a really incredible resource, thecasemaid.com. Please make sure that you click on it and dig into the resources there around messaging and making the case for housing development in your community. Really, really smart stuff there. So one of the reasons we mentioned that we don't have a lot of housing is because of lack of infrastructure. So the flip side of that is having stronger infrastructure allows for the conditions to create more housing. And when we're talking about infrastructure, we're primarily talking about water and sewer. So think of infrastructure like any other subsidy. Remember that towns can apply for Mass Works grants to pay for infrastructure projects that support housing, such as an on-site wastewater treatment system, and several towns in our region have done so. And again, what you zone for is what you get because it's what's easiest to build. And if you understand that dense village center development is the best way to address the housing crisis while protecting our environment, then you need to change your zoning to allow for multifamily housing by right. You can also consider form-based code to get your community agreeing on design elements. The Cape Cod Commission has a great report on form-based code in a Cape Cod context that you can find on their website. And also just a note about ADUs, that in order to create ADUs, changing zoning is a first step, but there are a lot of other barriers that exist. And at the CDP, we're working on addressing those other barriers through our Lower Cape Housing and ADU Resource Center. So happy to talk about that if anyone is curious. So as we mentioned, there are a lot of sources of local funding. We encourage towns to be proactive about allocating unrestricted funds to address housing for households up to 120 AMI, and for some towns even higher, for which there is very little government funding. Definitely increase your allocation of Community Preservation Act funds beyond the 10% requirements if you can. And make sure that funds for housing production are transferred directly to your trust so that the trust can be more effective. This is a list of some typical funding sources that towns put into their trusts. And then again, we can't stress enough the importance of using your short-term rental revenues. There is an op-ed in the Independent from several years ago that you can use to make the case in your town. And if this is something that you're interested in doing, we'd be very interested in helping you make the case to allocate your short-term rental revenues to housing. At this point, all towns have an affordable housing trust. Most, if not all, have a municipal affordable housing trust. But if you don't know too much about municipal affordable housing trust, it is useful to read this guide to understand what trusts can do and why they're really important. But essentially, affordable housing trust allows a town to build funds for housing production and respond to opportunities in their community more quickly than waiting for town meeting. So for example, if there is a property that would be great for housing, an affordable housing trust can put up the money to make that purchase rather than waiting until spring town meeting, that's not how the real estate market works. And at this point, many towns on the Lower Cape do have housing staff. This wasn't the case before we started the program, so that's very exciting. But this is just to say that allocating local funds to staff your housing department or to have housing staff is a really good use of local funds. And essentially, housing initiatives are really only advanced when it's someone's job. A note on regional collaboration. We believe that a rising tide lifts all boats, and sometimes it makes sense to support projects in other towns, even if it won't directly benefit your own subsidized housing inventory. There is a balance though, as most towns now have large scale development projects in the works. We really think that the projects that are already in your town should be prioritized for town funding. But it is also a viable strategy to support developments in other towns and across town lines. And we have a lot of beautiful examples of that in our region. Okay, got through all the slides. So this is just to say that this year's Housing Institute is still in progress. We have a mini workshop at the end of the month on our Lower Cape Housing and ADU Resource Center for folks who want to learn more about what we're doing, but also how towns can support ADU production. In March, we'll have a funding housing development workshop on the 14th. And as Brad mentioned, we have our peer group meetings coming up. Another thing that you can enjoy is that through town meeting season, we summarize all of the housing related articles across the 8 towns of the Lower Cape to show progress against housing production goals, get a sense of how much money was allocated in the region. And so that's something we distribute out after town meeting season. And that's it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And as Andrea mentioned, we will make sure to send everybody information afterwards on our website to everybody that has registered. And I did also want to put in the chat some upcoming programs that we have. And in the meantime, is there any questions that anybody has for Andrea or anybody else in the chat? Andrea, you did such a great job that nobody has any questions.
Everybody knows everything. No, it's a lot of information, but we are here to maintain open lines of communication. We want to be your best friend. We want to answer as many of your questions as we can, and we want to hear what you need in your communities to advance housing production so that we can dig in along with you. So please do reach out to Brad if there's any way that we can support you or if there's anything you think of afterwards.
Okay, well, thank you all. Thank you all so much for joining us. And like I said, we'll send out the recording, the YouTube recording, and any materials that we covered. So look for that. And we look forward to continued collaboration with all of you. Have a wonderful rest of the day and talk soon.